When Adolf Hitler's regime collapsed in the spring of 1945, the world focused on capturing war criminals, securing weapons, and piecing together the shattered remains of the Third Reich. But amid the chaos of Germany's defeat, dozens of luxury automobiles simply vanished into the smoke of history. Among them were some of the most technologically advanced and historically significant vehicles ever built, the massive armoured Mercedes-Benz 770K Grosser limousines that had carried the Führer through his years of power. These weren't just cars, they were rolling fortresses, symbols of Nazi might and witnesses to some of the 20th century's darkest moments. Today, more than 8 decades after the war's end, many of these vehicles remain unaccounted for, their whereabouts a mystery that continues to fascinate historians, collectors, and treasure hunters alike. Where did Hitler's Mercedes disappear to? Who took them? And why do some of these automobiles still spark fierce controversy? Wherever they surface, in this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first vehicle on our list. The story of Hitler's Mercedes collection begins in the 1930s, when the Nazi Party was consolidating its grip on Germany. Hitler had long been fascinated by automobiles and understood their propaganda value better than almost any other political leader of his time. He was often photographed in open-top touring cars, waving to adoring crowds during massive rallies and parades. For these public appearances, Hitler needed vehicles that projected strength, technological superiority, and absolute authority. The Mercedes-Benz company, already Germany's premier automaker, was eager to supply the Führer with the finest automobiles German engineering could produce. The result was a series of custom-built Mercedes-Benz 770 models, designated with the internal code W150. These were not ordinary luxury cars. Each 770K, the K standing for compressor or supercharger, was a masterpiece of 1930s automotive engineering, stretching over 20 feet in length and weighing up to 5 tons when fully armoured. The heart of each vehicle was a massive 7.7-litre straight-8 engine that produced 230 horsepower with the supercharger engaged, an astonishing figure for the era. But raw power was only part of the equation. Hitler's personal vehicles were fitted with armour plating up to 18 millimeters thick, bulletproof glass windows that could withstand rifle fire, and specially reinforced tyres that could run even when punctured. The interiors were lavishly appointed with the finest leather, rich wood trim, and communication equipment that allowed Hitler to remain in contact with his headquarters even while travelling. These rolling fortresses cost approximately 40,000 Reichsmarks each, roughly equivalent to $500,000 in today's currency, making them some of the most expensive automobiles in the world at the time. Hitler's motor pool, eventually, included at least 20 of these magnificent machines, each serving a specific purpose in the carefully choreographed theatre of Nazi power. Some were configured as open tourers for parades, allowing Hitler to stand and salute crowds while remaining visible to millions. Others were fully enclosed limousines for more secure travel, with their thick armour and bulletproof glass providing protection against potential assassins. The vehicles were maintained by a dedicated staff of mechanics who ensured that each Mercedes was in perfect working order at all times. Hitler was known to be particular about his cars, insisting that they be immaculately clean and mechanically flawless. He even had specific preferences about which vehicles to use for different occasions. For major state events and parades through Berlin, he preferred the largest and most impressive models. For trips to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, he used slightly smaller but still heavily armoured vehicles, better suited to the winding alpine roads. Each car in the collection represented not just transportation, but a carefully calculated element of Nazi propaganda, designed to reinforce Hitler's image as a modern, technologically advanced leader who commanded the finest that German industry could produce. The Mercedes-Benz company benefited enormously from this association, using their connection to Hitler to market their vehicles as the pinnacle of automotive achievement. Company representatives were often present at major Nazi events, and photographs of Hitler in his Mercedes appeared in advertisements and promotional materials around the world. This mutually beneficial relationship would continue throughout the Nazi era, with Mercedes-Benz producing not just luxury cars but also military trucks, aircraft engines, and other war material for the German military. As the war progressed and Germany's fortunes declined, the fate of Hitler's Mercedes became increasingly uncertain. By 1944, Allied bombing raids were devastating German cities and transportation networks. The Reich's leaders began making preparations for the inevitable defeat, moving valuable assets, documents, and personnel to secure locations. Hitler's car collection presented a unique problem. These vehicles were too large and too recognizable to easily hide, yet they were also potentially valuable both as historical artifacts and as sources of propaganda for whoever controlled them. Different vehicles from Hitler's fleet ended up in different locations as the Nazi regime crumbled. Some remained at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, where they would be captured by Soviet forces. Others were moved to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain headquarters in the Bavarian Alps. Still more were dispersed to various government facilities, military bases, and even private garages throughout Germany. As American, British, and Soviet forces advanced into Germany from all directions in early 1945, these scattered vehicles became prizes waiting to be claimed. Allied intelligence officers, treasure hunters, and ordinary soldiers all became aware that Hitler's personal automobiles might be worth capturing, both for their historical significance and their potential monetary value. The stage was set for one of the more unusual treasure hunts of the immediate post-war period, as various parties began searching for the missing Mercedes that had once carried the most hated man in the world. The first major discovery came in May 1945, just days after Germany's surrender. American forces advancing into the Berchtesgaden area made their way to Hitler's mountain retreat, the famous Eagle's Nest, and the associated Berghof complex, where the Führer had spent much of his time during the war. In the garage facilities near the Berghof, American soldiers found several of Hitler's personal Mercedes, along with vehicles belonging to other high-ranking Nazi leaders. These cars had been left behind when Hitler made his final journey to Berlin in early 1945, never to return to his beloved mountains. The Americans immediately recognized the significance of their find. Here were the actual vehicles that had carried Hitler through his years of power, rolling witnesses to history that could serve as both trophies and evidence of Nazi crimes. The question was, what to do with them? Military regulations were somewhat unclear about the disposition of such unusual captured property. Were these vehicles legitimate war booty that could be claimed by individual soldiers? Should they be preserved as historical evidence for war crimes trials? Or should they simply be destroyed as unwanted reminders of Nazi evil? Different authorities gave different answers, and in the confusion of the immediate post-war period, several of Hitler's Mercedes began journeys that would take them far from Germany. One of the most famous vehicles from the Berghof garage was a 1939 Mercedes-Benz 770K Offener Tourenwagen, an open touring car that Hitler had used extensively for parades and public appearances. This particular vehicle was notable for its special features, including extra-wide running boards that allowed SS bodyguards to stand alongside Hitler as he rode through crowds, and a grab handle mounted on the windshield frame that Hitler could hold while standing and saluting. The car's presence at Berchtesgaden suggests it had been used for Hitler's final visits to the mountain retreat before his death in Berlin. An American serviceman, recognizing the historical significance of the vehicle, arranged to have it shipped back to the United States as a war trophy. The exact details of how this was accomplished remain somewhat murky, as military regulations technically prohibited the unauthorized removal of such large items. Nevertheless, the Mercedes made its way across the Atlantic, becoming one of the first of Hitler's vehicles to reach American soil. Its arrival would mark the beginning of a long and controversial history that continues to this day, as we shall see. Meanwhile, Soviet forces advancing on Berlin from the east were making discoveries of their own. The Reich Chancellery, Hitler's primary headquarters in the German capital, contained an underground garage that housed several of the Führer's personal vehicles. When Soviet troops fought their way into the Chancellery complex in the final days of April 1945, they found these cars abandoned but largely intact, despite the fierce fighting that had raged above. The Soviets, like the Americans, immediately recognized the propaganda value of these vehicles. Here was physical proof of their victory over Nazi Germany, tangible symbols that could be displayed to show that the mighty Reich had fallen before Soviet power. Several of Hitler's Mercedes were quickly claimed by Soviet officers and officials, who either kept them for personal use or sent them back to Moscow as trophies. One vehicle reportedly became the personal car of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the military hero who had led Soviet forces to victory in the Battle of Berlin. Another was said to have been given to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin himself, though this claim remains difficult to verify. The Soviets were notably less transparent than the Western Allies about what they captured and what became of it, and many of the vehicles taken by Soviet forces simply disappeared into the vast bureaucracy of the Soviet state, never to be publicly seen again. The Soviet capture of Hitler's vehicles in Berlin highlighted a broader pattern that would define the story of the missing Mercedes for decades to come. These automobiles had become more than just cars. They had become symbols, relics, and in some cases, commodities. Different groups and individuals saw different value in them. For military victors, they represented trophies of conquest and tangible proof of Nazi Germany's defeat. For museums and historians, they were important artifacts that could help tell the story of the Nazi era and World War II. For collectors and enthusiasts, they were unique pieces of automotive history, regardless of their dark associations. And for some, they were simply valuable property that could be bought, sold, and traded like any other commodity. This multiplicity of perspectives would lead to fierce debates about what should be done with these vehicles. Debates that continue in some form even today. Should Hitler's cars be preserved in museums as educational tools? Should they be destroyed to avoid glorifying their former owner? Should they be allowed to exist in private collections? There were no easy answers, and different societies and institutions would reach different conclusions. Back in Germany, not all of Hitler's Mercedes had been captured immediately. Some vehicles remained hidden in the chaos of the immediate post-war period, tucked away in garages, warehouses, and private properties throughout the country. As Germany struggled to recover, from the devastation of total war, these hidden cars became valuable assets for those who knew about them. A luxury Mercedes, even one with such a dark history, could be sold or traded for desperately needed food, fuel, or currency in the harsh conditions of post-war Germany. Some vehicles were reportedly discovered by German civilians who had hidden them during the final days of the war, hoping to preserve them or perhaps claim them as their own property. Others were found by Allied occupation forces conducting searches of former Nazi government facilities. Each discovery sparked questions about ownership and disposition. Under Allied occupation law, property of the Nazi state was subject to confiscation, but the legal status of vehicles that had been personal property of the Führer himself was less clear. Were they state property? Personal property? War booty? The answers varied depending on which zone of occupation the vehicle was found in and which officers were making the decisions. One particularly interesting case involved a Mercedes that was discovered in a barn in rural Bavaria in late 1945. The vehicle had apparently been hidden there by someone connected to the Nazi government, possibly in the hopes of retrieving it after the war or selling it on the black market. When American occupation authorities learned of the car's existence, they dispatched a team to inspect and claim it. The farmer who owned the barn insisted he had no knowledge of how the car had ended up on his property and claimed he had simply found it there after the war ended. Whether this was true or whether he had been paid to hide it was never definitively established. The Americans took possession of the vehicle regardless, adding it to the growing collection of Nazi artifacts being gathered for potential use in war crimes trials and historical documentation. This particular Mercedes eventually ended up in American hands and was reportedly used by occupation officials for official transportation for a brief period before being shipped to the United States. The idea of using Hitler's former car for mundane administrative purposes struck some as darkly ironic, while others saw it as a fitting come-down for a vehicle that had once represented supreme power. The American military's acquisition of several Hitler Mercedes created a peculiar problem for US authorities. What exactly should be done with these vehicles? They were undeniably valuable and historically significant, but they were also uncomfortable reminders of an evil regime and a brutal war that had cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. In 1946, the US Army made the decision to ship several captured Hitler vehicles back to the United States for display and study. The official justification was that these cars would serve as educational tools, helping Americans understand the nature of the Nazi regime and the war that had just been fought. They would be displayed at military facilities and museums where they could be seen by the public and used to illustrate the story of World War II. However, there was also an element of trophy-taking to these acquisitions. These were the vehicles of America's greatest enemy, and possessing them was a symbol of complete victory. The cars were carefully loaded onto transport ships and sent across the Atlantic, beginning new chapters in their already extraordinary histories. Their arrival in America would spark the first of many controversies that would surround Hitler's Mercedes for decades to come. One of the first Hitler Mercedes to attract public attention in the United States was displayed at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a U.S. Army facility that specialized in testing and evaluating military equipment. The massive armored limousine was exhibited alongside captured German tanks, artillery pieces, and other war materiel, creating a kind of informal museum of captured Nazi equipment. Visitors to Aberdeen could walk around the vehicle, peer through its bulletproof windows, and imagine Hitler riding through the streets of Berlin or Nuremberg at the height of his power. The car became a popular attraction, drawing thousands of visitors who wanted to see this tangible piece of history for themselves. However, not everyone was comfortable with this public display. Some critics argued that exhibiting Hitler's car was tantamount to glorifying the Nazi leader and his regime. They worried that the vehicle would become a shrine for neo-Nazis or a macabre tourist attraction that trivialized the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II. These concerns would be raised repeatedly over the following decades, whenever Hitler's Mercedes appeared in public settings, reflecting deep discomfort with the idea of preserving and displaying artifacts so closely associated with evil. While some of Hitler's vehicles remained in military or museum settings, others took more unusual paths. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, several Mercedes that had been part of Hitler's motor pool began appearing on the civilian market. How exactly these vehicles entered private hands remains unclear in many cases, but it appears that some American servicemen who had acquired the cars as war trophies later decided to sell them. After all, maintaining a massive 1930s luxury car was expensive, and the historical significance that made these vehicles interesting also made them potentially valuable. The first documented private sale of a Hitler Mercedes occurred in 1948, when a former American officer sold one of the vehicles to a collector in California for an undisclosed sum. This transaction opened the floodgates, and over the next several years, a small but steady stream of Hitler's Mercedes entered the American collector car market. Prices varied widely depending on the vehicle's condition, provenance, and the strength of the documentation proving it had actually been Hitler's car. Some sold for a few $1,000s, while others commanded prices in the tens of thousands, enormous sums for automobiles in that era. The buyers were a diverse group, including wealthy car collectors, history buffs, and museum operators who saw the vehicles as important historical artifacts worth preserving. The emergence of a market for Hitler's cars raised troubling questions about the ethics of collecting and selling such objects. Was it appropriate to treat these vehicles as collectibles like any other antique automobile? Or did their association with Hitler make them fundamentally different, objects that should not be privately owned or commercially traded? There were no clear answers, and opinions varied widely. Some argued that the cars were simply historical artifacts whose ownership should not be restricted based on their former owner. Others contended that profiting from items associated with Hitler was morally repugnant, and that all such objects should be donated to museums or destroyed. These debates would intensify over the following decades as the market for Nazi memorabilia grew and prices for Hitler-associated items skyrocketed. By the 1970s, a well-documented Hitler Mercedes could fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars, and by the 2000s, prices had climbed into the millions. This commercial value created perverse incentives, as sellers exaggerated or fabricated connections to Hitler in order to increase the value of otherwise ordinary vintage Mercedes automobiles. Determining which cars had genuinely been Hitler's personal vehicles and which were simply similar models from the same era became an increasingly difficult task, one that would challenge historians and collectors for years to come. The authentication challenge was compounded by the fact that Mercedes-Benz produced multiple 770K vehicles for various Nazi leaders and government officials during the 1930s and early 1940s. Not every large black Mercedes from this period had been Hitler's personal car, even if it looked identical to vehicles that had carried the Führer. Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and other top Nazi leaders also owned similar vehicles, and distinguishing between them required careful examination of chassis numbers, production records, and historical documentation. Mercedes-Benz Company archives, which survived the war largely intact, became crucial resources for researchers attempting to verify the provenance of specific vehicles. The company maintained detailed records of which cars had been delivered to which customers, including exact specifications and chassis numbers. By cross-referencing these records with photographic evidence showing Hitler in specific vehicles, researchers could sometimes definitively establish whether a particular car had been part of the Führer's personal fleet. However, this process was complicated by the fact that some records had been lost or destroyed during the war, and photographs did not always provide clear views of identifying features. As a result, the authenticity of many claimed Hitler Mercedes remained disputed, with different experts reaching different conclusions about the same vehicles. One of the most thoroughly documented Hitler Mercedes is currently housed at the War Museum in Ottawa, Canada. This 1940 Mercedes-Benz 770 Großer offener Tourenwagen was discovered by American forces at Berchtesgaden in May 1945 and subsequently shipped to the United States. The vehicle was displayed at various military facilities before being transferred to the Canadian War Museum in 1970. Extensive research has confirmed that this specific car, bearing chassis number 189744, was indeed used by Hitler for parades and public appearances, particularly during his visits to occupied territories. Photographs clearly show Hitler standing in this exact vehicle during his infamous visit to Paris in June 1940, when he toured the conquered French capital in a choreographed display of Nazi triumph. The car's presence in Canada has occasionally sparked controversy, with some arguing that it should not be displayed due to its association with Hitler. However, museum officials have maintained that the vehicle serves an important educational purpose, helping visitors understand the propaganda techniques used by the Nazi regime and the reality of Hitler's power during the war years. The museum displays the car alongside extensive explanatory text that contextualizes its history and discusses the ethical issues surrounding its preservation and exhibition. Another well-documented Hitler Mercedes resides at the Lion Air Museum in Santa Ana, California. This vehicle, a 1942 Mercedes-Benz 770K armored limousine, has a particularly interesting provenance. The car was reportedly found by American forces in an underground garage near Hitler's bunker in Berlin and was subsequently shipped to the United States. For many years, it was displayed at various locations before being acquired by the Lion Air Museum, which specializes in World War II-era aircraft and vehicles. The museum's approach to displaying the vehicle has evolved over time, reflecting changing societal attitudes toward Nazi artifacts. Initially, the car was exhibited with minimal context, presented simply as an interesting piece of automotive and military history. However, as awareness grew about the need to contextualize such objects and prevent them from being seen as glamorizing Nazism, the museum added extensive educational materials discussing Hitler's crimes, the Holocaust, and the dangers of totalitarianism. Today, visitors who view the vehicle are confronted not just with the car itself, but with detailed information about the regime it represented and the millions of people who suffered and died under Nazi rule. This approach represents an attempt to preserve historically significant artifacts while ensuring they are not misunderstood or misused. Not all of Hitler's Mercedes ended up in museums or institutional collections. Several remain in private hands, owned by wealthy collectors who view them as important pieces of automotive and historical significance. One such vehicle made headlines in 2018 when it was offered for sale at an auction in Scottsdale, Arizona. The 1939 Mercedes-Benz 770K Großer offener Tourenwagen, described as having been used by Hitler during parades in Poland and Czechoslovakia, was estimated to sell for between $7 and $10 million. The auction sparked immediate controversy, with Holocaust survivors groups and anti-hate organizations calling for the sale to be cancelled. They argued that allowing such a vehicle to be sold commercially was deeply offensive and risked glorifying Hitler and the Nazi regime. The auction house defended the sale, stating that the vehicle was an important historical artifact and that its sale did not constitute endorsement of Nazi ideology. They pointed out that museums and educational institutions could bid on the vehicle, potentially adding it to public collections where it could serve educational purposes. In the end, the car failed to sell, with bidding not reaching the reserve price. Whether this was due to the controversy, the high price, or simple lack of interest among potential buyers remained unclear. The incident highlighted the ongoing tensions surrounding Hitler's vehicles and the broader question of how to handle artifacts associated with Nazi Germany. The controversy in Scottsdale was not the first time a Hitler Mercedes had sparked public outcry. In 1973, a similar incident occurred when Earl Clark, the owner of a scrap metal business in New Hampshire, announced plans to display a Hitler Mercedes he had purchased. Clark had acquired the vehicle, reportedly one of the cars captured at Berchtesgaden, with the intention of exhibiting it to the public. He believed the car had educational value and could help people understand the reality of the Nazi era. However, his plans met with fierce opposition from local community members, particularly Holocaust survivors who lived in the area. They organized protests and petitioned local authorities to prevent the display, arguing that it would cause pain to those who had suffered under Nazi persecution and might attract neo-Nazis to the area. The controversy became so heated that Clark ultimately decided to sell the vehicle rather than continue fighting to display it. This incident demonstrated the deep emotional wounds that World War II and the Holocaust had left, wounds that could be reopened by something as seemingly innocuous as displaying an old car. It also showed that the passage of time had not made these questions easier. In fact, as memories of the war faded and direct witnesses became fewer, the debates about how to handle Nazi artifacts were becoming more, not less, contentious. The question of what to do with Hitler's vehicles took on new dimensions as the decades passed. By the 1980s and 1990s, World War II was increasingly becoming history rather than living memory. Most of the people who had experienced the war firsthand were elderly or deceased, and new generations were learning about the conflict primarily through books, films, and museum exhibits rather than personal recollection. This generational shift changed how people related to artifacts from the Nazi era. For those who had lived through the war, Hitler's Mercedes were visceral reminders of a terrible time, objects that could trigger traumatic memories and deep emotional responses. For younger people who knew the war only as history, the cars were fascinating relics from a dramatic period, objects that could help make abstract historical events feel more concrete and real. This generational divide often manifested in different attitudes toward the preservation and display of Hitler's vehicles, with older individuals more likely to favor destruction or concealment, and younger people more likely to support museum display and historical preservation. Neither perspective was inherently right or wrong, they simply reflected different relationships to history and different understandings of how best to remember and learn from the past. The debate over Hitler's Mercedes also intersected with broader questions about the preservation of controversial historical artifacts. Museums around the world grapple with similar issues regarding objects associated with slavery, colonialism, genocide, and other dark chapters of human history. Should such objects be preserved and displayed? If so, how should they be contextualized to ensure they educate rather than glorify? Who should have the authority to make these decisions? These questions have no simple answers, and different institutions have reached different conclusions based on their specific contexts and missions. Some museums have chosen to display controversial artifacts prominently, using them as focal points for discussions about historical atrocities and ongoing struggles for human rights. Others have relegated such objects to storage or destroyed them entirely, concluding that the risk of misinterpretation or misuse outweighed any educational benefit. Still, others have taken middle paths, displaying controversial items only in special exhibits with extensive contextual material, or making them available to researchers while keeping them out of public view. The debates surrounding Hitler's Mercedes reflect these broader museum and heritage controversies, serving as case studies for how societies choose to remember difficult histories. One aspect of the Hitler Mercedes story that receives less attention is the role of these vehicles in Soviet and Eastern European history. As mentioned earlier, Soviet forces captured several of Hitler's cars when they took Berlin in 1945. What happened to these vehicles under communist rule provides a fascinating counterpoint to their fates in the West. Unlike in the United States and Western Europe, where the cars became controversial objects of debate, in the Soviet Union they were simply absorbed into the state apparatus and used for official purposes or displayed as war trophies. Soviet leaders were not particularly concerned about the ethical implications of possessing Hitler's vehicles. They saw them purely as spoils of war and symbols of Soviet victory over fascism. At least one Hitler Mercedes was reportedly used as an official state car in the Soviet Union for several years, driven by high-ranking Communist Party officials who apparently felt no qualms about riding in the former Führer's automobile. This vehicle, along with several others captured by Soviet forces, eventually ended up in Soviet military museums, where they were displayed alongside captured German tanks, artillery, and other equipment. The exhibits emphasized Soviet military prowess and the defeat of Nazi Germany, with little attention paid to the more complex ethical questions that consumed Western curators and collectors. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, some of these vehicles came to light in new contexts. Russian oligarchs and businessmen, newly wealthy from the privatization of Soviet state assets, became interested in collecting rare and unusual automobiles. Hitler's Mercedes, combining historical significance with extreme rarity, became highly desirable items in this new Russian collector market. At least 2 vehicles that had been in Soviet custody since 1945 were sold to private Russian collectors in the 1990s, fetching prices in the millions of dollars. These sales occurred with little of the controversy that surrounded similar transactions in the West, reflecting different cultural attitudes toward World War II memorabilia, and perhaps a different relationship to that historical period. For Russians who had suffered enormously during the war, Hitler's vehicles were powerful symbols of a defeated enemy, objects that represented Russian strength and survival, rather than Nazi power. This different perspective allowed for a more straightforward commercial relationship with these artifacts, unencumbered by some of the ethical concerns that complicated their status in Germany, the United States, and other Western countries. The Mercedes-Benz company itself had a complicated relationship with its most infamous customer. During the Nazi era, the company had enthusiastically embraced its role as supplier to the Third Reich, using its association with Hitler as a marketing tool and benefiting enormously from military contracts for trucks, engines, and other war materiel. After the war, Mercedes faced a difficult reckoning with this past. Company executives initially downplayed the extent of their cooperation with the Nazi regime, emphasizing that they had simply been businessmen trying to survive in difficult circumstances. However, as historical research revealed the depth of Mercedes-Benz's collaboration with the Nazis, including the company's use of forced labor during the war, this position became increasingly untenable. By the 1980s, Mercedes-Benz had begun to acknowledge its Nazi past more openly, conducting research into the company's history and providing compensation to some former forced laborers. This corporate reckoning intersected with the story of Hitler's vehicles in interesting ways. When asked about specific cars that had been built for Hitler, Mercedes-Benz archivists were generally helpful, providing chassis numbers and production details from company records. However, the company was careful not to celebrate or market these vehicles in any way, conscious of the reputational risks of being too closely associated with Nazi history. This delicate balancing act, acknowledging history without glorifying it, would become a model for how the company dealt with its past more broadly. Among the most intriguing mysteries in the story of Hitler's missing Mercedes is the question of how many vehicles from his personal fleet remain unaccounted for. Historical records suggest that Hitler's motor pool included approximately 20 Mercedes-Benz 770K vehicles at its peak, along with smaller cars for less formal occasions and backup vehicles. Of these, somewhere between 8 and 12 have been definitively located and documented over the years, most now in museums or known private collections. This means that roughly half of Hitler's cars remain missing, their fates unknown. Some were almost certainly destroyed during the war, victims of Allied bombing raids or the intense fighting that engulfed Germany in 1945. Several vehicles were known to be in Berlin during the final assault on the city, and it is likely that some of these were destroyed in the street fighting or subsequent fires that swept through the German capital. Others may have been deliberately destroyed by Nazi officials who did not want them to fall into enemy hands, though there is little documentation of such actions. Still, others might have been taken apart for scrap metal during the desperate final months of the war, when Germany was desperately short of raw materials. However, the possibility remains that some vehicles survived the war intact and were simply never discovered or have been kept hidden for 8 decades. Every few years, a story emerges of a Hitler Mercedes supposedly found in a barn, garage, or warehouse somewhere in Europe or beyond. Most of these stories turn out to be false, either hoaxes or cases of mistaken identity involving similar vehicles. But the tantalizing possibility that genuine Hitler cars might still be out there, waiting to be discovered, keeps treasure hunters and historians searching. One of the more credible claims of a newly discovered Hitler Mercedes emerged in 2009, when a Norwegian businessman announced that he had found what he believed to be one of the Führer's personal vehicles in a collection of vintage cars he had recently acquired. The vehicle, a 1940 Mercedes-Benz 770K, had supposedly been brought to Norway by a Wehrmacht officer during the German occupation and had remained hidden there ever since. The owner hired experts to examine the car and attempt to verify its provenance. Researchers pored over chassis numbers, compared the vehicle to historical photographs, and examined every detail of its construction and equipment. The investigation revealed that the car was indeed a genuine 770K from the correct time period, and that it had features consistent with vehicles built for high-ranking Nazi officials. However, definitively proving that this specific car had been Hitler's personal vehicle proved elusive. There were no clear photographs showing Hitler in this exact car, and the chassis number, while consistent with the right time frame, could not be matched to specific delivery records. After extensive research, experts concluded that the car had probably been built for a high-ranking Nazi official, possibly even for Hitler's motor pool, but that there was insufficient evidence to prove it had been Hitler's personal vehicle. This conclusion dramatically affected the car's value. A genuine Hitler car might be worth millions, while a vehicle merely associated with the Nazi leadership was worth far less. The case illustrated the challenge of authenticating these vehicles and the high stakes involved in making such determinations. The authentication challenge has led to the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for evaluating claimed Hitler vehicles. Experts now use a combination of documentary research, forensic examination, and photographic analysis to make their determinations. Documentary research involves tracking down original production records from Mercedes-Benz, searching for delivery documents, and investigating any available Nazi-era paperwork that might mention specific vehicles. This can be extremely difficult, as many records were destroyed during the war or lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Forensic examination includes careful inspection of chassis numbers, engine numbers, and other identifying marks, looking for signs of alteration or forgery. Experts have become skilled at detecting fake or altered numbers, a common practice among those trying to pass off ordinary vintage Mercedes as Hitler cars. Photographic analysis has become particularly important, as numerous photographs exist showing Hitler in various vehicles throughout the Nazi era. By carefully examining these images and comparing details like specific body modifications, running board configurations, interior features, and damage marks, experts can sometimes match a surviving vehicle to a car visible in historical photographs. Modern digital enhancement techniques have made this process more precise, allowing researchers to zoom in on details that would have been invisible in older print photographs. When all three types of evidence align, researchers can be fairly confident about a vehicle's authenticity. When they conflict or when evidence is lacking, the vehicle's status remains uncertain, consigned to a kind of automotive purgatory where it is neither definitively Hitler's nor definitively not. The complexity of authentication has not prevented forgeries and false claims from flourishing. The enormous potential value of a genuine Hitler Mercedes creates powerful incentives for fraud. Over the years, numerous vehicles have been presented as Hitler cars despite having little or no legitimate claim to that provenance. Some frauds are relatively simple, involving sellers who simply lie about a car's history with no supporting evidence. These are usually easy to detect, as any serious buyer or museum will demand documentation before accepting such a significant claim. More sophisticated frauds involve the fabrication of false documentation, the alteration of chassis numbers to match known Hitler vehicles, or the creation of elaborate backstories complete with fake photographs and forged letters. These require more expertise to detect and have occasionally fooled even knowledgeable collectors and institutions, at least temporarily. One infamous case in the 1980s involved a car presented as Hitler's personal limousine, complete with what appeared to be authentic documentation and a convincing story about how it had been smuggled out of Germany after the war. The vehicle sold for a substantial sum before researchers discovered that the chassis number had been altered and that the supposed documentation was cleverly forged. The buyer eventually recovered his money, but the incident highlighted the risks involved in the Hitler Mercedes market and the need for extreme caution when evaluating such claims. Beyond the question of authenticity lies the deeper question of why anyone would want to own Hitler's car in the first place. The motivations of Hitler Mercedes collectors are diverse and not always easily categorized. Some are serious. Automotive historians and enthusiasts who view these vehicles as important examples of 1930s engineering and design, regardless of who owned them. They appreciate the cars for their technical sophistication, their beautiful coachwork, and their place in automotive history. For these collectors, Hitler's ownership is an interesting historical detail, but not the primary source of the car's appeal. Others are interested specifically in World War II history and view the vehicles as tangible connections to that pivotal period. They see the cars as three-dimensional history lessons, objects that can help people understand the reality of the Nazi era in a way that books and photographs cannot. For these collectors, preserving and studying Hitler's cars is a form of historical preservation, an attempt to ensure that physical evidence of this dark period survives for future generations. Still, others are drawn to the vehicles precisely because of their association with Hitler, finding something fascinating or compelling in owning an object that belonged to one of history's most notorious figures. This group includes a range of individuals, from those with a morbid curiosity about evil to, in some cases, individuals with genuinely troubling sympathies for Nazi ideology. Distinguishing between these different types of collectors and understanding their motivations has important implications for how society chooses to regulate the sale and ownership of such objects. The existence of collectors with neo-Nazi sympathies has been a recurring concern in debates about Hitler's vehicles. There have been documented cases of individuals with far-right political views attempting to acquire Hitler memorabilia, including his cars, as a way of celebrating or venerating the Nazi leader. Such collectors typically keep their acquisitions private, understanding that public display would likely trigger outrage and possibly legal consequences in countries with laws against Nazi propaganda. The possibility that Hitler's vehicles might end up in the hands of Nazi sympathizers has led some to argue that these cars should not be allowed to exist in private hands at all, but should instead be restricted to museum collections where their display can be controlled and contextualized. Others counter that restricting ownership based on ideological concerns sets a dangerous precedent, and that the solution is not to ban private ownership, but to ensure that all Hitler vehicles, regardless of who owns them, are properly documented and that their existence is publicly acknowledged. This allows historians and the public to track where these objects are and what is being done with them, rather than driving them underground where they might indeed become secret shrines to Nazi ideology. The debate reflects larger tensions between freedom of ownership and concerns about the potential misuse of historically significant and ideologically charged objects. Germany itself has taken a particularly careful approach to Hitler's vehicles and Nazi memorabilia more broadly. German law strictly prohibits the public display of Nazi symbols and the glorification of the Nazi regime, with violations subject to criminal prosecution. This has created a unique legal environment where owning a Hitler Mercedes is not illegal per se, but displaying it publicly in a way that glorifies Hitler or the Nazi regime could be. German museums that possess Hitler vehicles are required to display them with extensive educational context, making clear that they are being shown as examples of Nazi propaganda and as warnings about the dangers of totalitarianism, not as celebration of Hitler or his regime. Private collectors in Germany who own Hitler vehicles typically keep them completely out of public view, understanding that any public display could potentially violate German law and would certainly trigger intense controversy. This has led to a situation where Germany, the country where these vehicles were built and where Hitler used them, is paradoxically one of the hardest places to see them. The irony is not lost on observers, though most Germans appear comfortable with this arrangement, viewing it as an appropriate response to their country's difficult history. The legal framework surrounding Nazi memorabilia varies significantly from country to country, creating a patchwork of different regulations that affects how Hitler's vehicles circulate internationally. In Germany and Austria, as mentioned, laws restrict the display of Nazi symbols and materials. In France, the sale of Nazi memorabilia is legal but tightly regulated. In the United States and United Kingdom, there are virtually no legal restrictions on owning or selling such objects, though institutions like eBay have voluntarily banned the sale of most Nazi items on their platforms. This variation in legal approaches creates opportunities for what might be called provenance arbitrage, where objects flow toward jurisdictions with more permissive laws. Several Hitler vehicles have moved from Europe to the United States over the years, partly because American law allows for their more open display and commercial trade. Conversely, some European museums and collectors have been reluctant to loan Hitler vehicles to American institutions, fearing that the different legal and cultural context might lead to their being displayed inappropriately or falling into the wrong hands. These cross-border complexities add another layer to the already intricate story of how these vehicles have been dispersed and preserved. Military museums have played a particularly important role in preserving Hitler's vehicles while attempting to provide appropriate historical context. The Canadian War Museum's approach to its Hitler Mercedes, mentioned earlier, represents one model for how such institutions balance preservation and education with ethical concerns. The museum displays the vehicle in a gallery devoted to the Second World War, surrounded by extensive text panels that explain the car's history, its role in Nazi propaganda, and the broader context of Hitler's regime and the Holocaust. Visitors cannot simply admire the vehicle as a beautiful car, they are confronted with information about the atrocities committed by the regime it represented. The museum also uses the car as a starting point for discussing broader themes of propaganda, militarism, and the importance of democratic values. Importantly, the museum solicits and displays feedback from visitors, including Holocaust survivors, about their reactions to seeing the vehicle. This creates a dialogue about the ethics of preservation and display rather than presenting a single institutional perspective. Other museums have adopted similar approaches, using Hitler's vehicles as focal points for exhibitions that grapple with difficult questions about how to remember and learn from the Nazi era. These thoughtful, contextualized displays represent what many consider to be best practices for handling controversial historical artifacts. Not all displays of Hitler's vehicles have been equally thoughtful or educational. Some private museums and tourist attractions have exhibited the cars with minimal context, presenting them primarily as curiosities or even celebrating them as examples of fine automotive engineering without adequately acknowledging their dark history. Such displays have typically generated criticism from historians and Holocaust education groups, who argue that presenting Hitler's vehicles without proper context risks trivializing the Holocaust and glorifying the Nazi regime. In some cases, public pressure has forced institutions to add more educational material or to remove Hitler vehicles from display entirely. One particularly controversial case occurred in the 1990s when a small museum in the American Southwest displayed a purported Hitler Mercedes alongside other vintage cars, with only a small placard noting its provenance. Holocaust survivors and their families organized protests, and local media coverage highlighted the museum's apparent insensitivity. The museum initially defended its display, arguing that the car was simply part of automotive history and that visitors could draw their own conclusions about its significance. However, as the controversy intensified and began to affect the museum's reputation and attendance, the owners ultimately decided to sell the vehicle and remove it from display. The incident demonstrated that public opinion, not just laws or regulations, plays a crucial role in determining how and where Hitler's vehicles can be shown. The question of what should happen to Hitler's vehicles after their current owners die represents an ongoing challenge. Many of the cars are currently owned by elderly collectors who acquired them decades ago. When these individuals pass away, their estates must decide what to do with vehicles that may be worth millions of dollars but carry enormous ethical baggage. Some collectors have made arrangements to donate their Hitler Mercedes to museums after their deaths, ensuring that the vehicles will be preserved and displayed in educational contexts. Others have specified that the cars should be sold, often with the proceeds going to Holocaust education or other charitable causes. A few have reportedly arranged for their Hitler vehicles to be destroyed after their deaths, concluding that these objects should not be allowed to continue existing. Each approach reflects different judgments about the value of preserving these artifacts versus the risks of their continued existence. Increasingly, estate planners and attorneys find themselves grappling with these unusual questions, trying to balance the wishes of deceased collectors with broader social concerns and the practical challenges of disposing of such controversial property. The insurance industry has also had to adapt to the unique challenges posed by Hitler's vehicles. Insuring a multi-million-dollar antique car that could be vandalized or attacked because of its association with Hitler presents unusual risk calculations. Some insurance companies have refused to cover Hitler vehicles altogether, viewing them as too risky or too controversial. Others will provide coverage, but at extremely high premiums that reflect both the vehicle's enormous value and the special risks they face. Insurance policies for Hitler Mercedes typically include special security requirements, mandating that the vehicles be stored in secure, climate-controlled facilities with advanced alarm systems, and sometimes requiring that their locations be kept confidential to reduce the risk of attacks by those who find their existence offensive. There have been a few documented cases of Hitler vehicles being vandalized or damaged, including one incident in which an individual attempted to set fire to a Hitler Mercedes on display at a museum, apparently motivated by outrage that such an object was being preserved. Such incidents, while rare, have made insurers increasingly cautious about covering these vehicles and have reinforced arguments that they should only exist in highly secure museum settings. The role of auction houses in the Hitler Mercedes market deserves particular attention, as these institutions have often found themselves at the center of controversies over the sale of Nazi-related items. Major auction houses like Sotheby's, Christie's, and specialized automotive auction companies have occasionally handled Hitler vehicles over the years, with each sale generating intense debate. Auction houses must balance multiple considerations when deciding whether to accept Hitler vehicles for sale. On one hand, these are historically significant and extremely valuable objects that can generate substantial commission revenue. On the other hand, auctioning Hitler memorabilia can damage an auction house's reputation and alienate clients who find such sales offensive. Different houses have adopted different policies. Some refuse to handle Hitler vehicles altogether as a matter of principle. Others will accept them, but only under strict conditions, requiring extensive provenance documentation and sometimes donating a portion of proceeds to Holocaust education. Still, others treat Hitler Mercedes like any other high-value antique automobile, viewing questions about their appropriateness as outside their purview as commercial intermediaries. When auction houses do sell Hitler vehicles, they typically include extensive historical information in their catalogue descriptions, partly to educate potential buyers and partly to protect themselves from accusations of glorifying Nazism. The catalogue language often emphasizes the vehicle's importance as historical artifacts and warnings about totalitarianism, attempting to frame the sale in educational rather than celebratory terms. The technological features of Hitler's Mercedes-Benz 770K vehicles themselves deserve closer examination, as understanding what made these cars special helps explain both their historical significance and their enduring appeal to collectors. The 770K was the pinnacle of 1930s automotive engineering, incorporating features and capabilities that would not become common in ordinary automobiles for decades. The massive 7.7-litre straight-8 engine was a masterpiece of precision engineering, with each component machined to extremely tight tolerances and assembled by hand. The supercharger, which could be engaged by fully depressing the accelerator pedal, forced additional air into the engine and provided dramatic bursts of power when needed. This allowed the enormously heavy vehicle to accelerate with surprising vigor, despite weighing more than 3 tons. The armored versions, which comprise most of Hitler's personal vehicles, incorporated armor plating made from specially hardened steel that had been developed for military applications. This armor was integrated into the vehicle's structure in ways that preserved the car's elegant lines while providing protection against small arms fire. The bulletproof glass, manufactured by several different German companies experimenting with laminated glass technology, consisted of multiple layers of glass and plastic bonded together to create transparent panels that could stop bullets without shattering. The engineering required to make windows that heavy move smoothly up and down was considerable, requiring specially designed mechanisms and powerful electric motors. The interiors of Hitler's Mercedes were equally impressive from a technical standpoint. The vehicles included advanced communication systems for their era, with radio equipment that allowed Hitler to remain in contact with his headquarters even while traveling. Some vehicles were equipped with early forms of air conditioning, a rare luxury in the 1930s. The seats were upholstered in the finest leather, often specially tanned and treated to remain supple in all weather conditions. Extensive soundproofing ensured that conversations inside the vehicle could not be overheard from outside, an important consideration for a political leader discussing sensitive matters. The suspension system was specially designed to provide a smooth ride despite the enormous weight of the armoured bodies, using innovative spring and shock absorber configurations that were ahead of their time. Even small details received extraordinary attention, with custom-made door handles, window cranks, and interior fittings that combined functionality with aesthetic elegance. Every component of a Hitler Mercedes was built to the highest possible standard, with cost being essentially no object. This combination of cutting-edge technology, luxurious materials, and meticulous craftsmanship resulted in vehicles that were genuinely extraordinary for their time and remain impressive even by modern standards. The maintenance and restoration of surviving Hitler vehicles presents unique challenges for current owners and institutions. These cars were built using 1930s technology and materials, some of which are no longer available or manufactured. Finding replacement parts for a 770K is extremely difficult, as Mercedes-Benz stopped producing these vehicles in the 1940s and many specialized components were custom-made for Hitler's specific vehicles. Owners and museums have had to become creative in maintaining these cars, sometimes fabricating replacement parts from scratch or adapting components from other vehicles. The armoured bodies present particular challenges, as the armour plating use specialised steels that are difficult to replicate today. When these vehicles require bodywork, craftsmen must carefully work around the armour plating or, in some cases, carefully remove and reinstall it. The electrical systems, primitive by modern standards but sophisticated for the 1930s, require specialists familiar with pre-war German automotive electrics. Even the tyres are challenging, as the original tyre sizes are no longer manufactured, and modern alternatives must be specially ordered or custom-made. Some institutions, like the Canadian War Museum, have made the decision to preserve their Hitler Mercedes in as-found condition, performing only minimal maintenance to prevent further deterioration but not attempting to restore the vehicle to like-new condition. This approach preserves the car's authenticity and the physical evidence of its history, including wear and damage from decades of use and storage. Other owners have pursued complete restorations, bringing their vehicles back to the condition they would have been in when new. This makes for more visually impressive displays but raises questions about authenticity and whether such extensive restoration somehow sanitizes the vehicle's history. The question of whether Hitler's Mercedes should be kept in running condition has generated particular debate. Maintaining these vehicles in operational condition requires regular use, as mechanical components that sit unused for long periods tend to deteriorate. However, actually driving a Hitler Mercedes raises uncomfortable questions. Is it appropriate to drive a vehicle that once carried history's most notorious mass murderer? Does doing so constitute a form of glorification? Different institutions and owners have reached different conclusions. Some keep their vehicles in running order and occasionally drive them, arguing that demonstrating how they actually functioned is educational and helps preserve the machines. Others have made the decision to preserve their Hitler Mercedes as static displays only, never starting the engines or moving the vehicles under their own power. A few have gone further, deliberately disabling the vehicles to ensure they can never be driven again, viewing this as an appropriate way to ensure the cars cannot be misused. The Canadian War Museum, for instance, maintains its Hitler Mercedes in running condition and occasionally starts the engine for mechanical preservation purposes, but the vehicle is never driven outside the museum and is not displayed as an operational vehicle. The digital age has brought new dimensions to the story of Hitler's vehicles. The internet has made information about these cars more widely available than ever before, with detailed photographs, historical documents, and scholarly articles accessible to anyone with an internet connection. This democratization of information has helped combat some of the mythology and misinformation that long surrounded Hitler's Mercedes, allowing researchers to more easily verify claims and expose frauds. However, the internet has also created new challenges. Online auction sites and classified advertisement platforms have made it easier to buy and sell Nazi memorabilia, including vehicles, often with minimal oversight or verification. forums, and social media groups dedicated to World War II history and vintage automobiles sometimes attract individuals with troubling ideological motivations, creating spaces where Hitler's vehicles are discussed in ways that edge toward glorification. Museums and educational institutions have responded by creating their own online resources about Hitler's vehicles, providing accurate historical information and appropriate context in an attempt to counter misinformation and inappropriate celebration. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, for instance, includes information about Nazi vehicles in its online educational materials, using them as examples of how the Nazi regime used technology and propaganda to consolidate power. One lesser-known aspect of Hitler's vehicle collection is that it extended beyond Mercedes-Benz automobiles. While the 770K Mercedes models were his most famous and frequently used vehicles, Hitler's motor pool also included cars from other manufacturers. Several Volkswagen prototypes were built for Hitler's use, though these were never as prominent as the Mercedes vehicles. Hitler also had access to various utility vehicles, smaller cars for less formal occasions, and even some captured foreign vehicles that had been modified for his use. After the Allied invasion of France in 1944, a captured American Jeep was reportedly modified with armor and special fittings for potential use by Hitler, though there is no evidence he ever actually rode in it. These non-Mercedes vehicles have received far less attention from collectors and historians, partly because they are less dramatic and impressive than the massive 770K limousines, and partly because their provenance is often more difficult to establish. Nevertheless, they form an important part of the full story of Hitler's relationship with automobiles and the Nazi regime's use of vehicles for both practical transportation and propaganda purposes. A few of these lesser-known vehicles have surfaced over the years in various collections, though they typically generate far less interest and controversy than the iconic Mercedes models. The story of Hitler's missing Mercedes also intersects with the broader history of art and artifact looting during and after World War II. Just as paintings, sculptures, and other cultural treasures were stolen by Nazi forces and then subsequently seized by Allied troops, so too were vehicles and other valuable movable property caught up in the massive displacement of assets that accompanied the war. The legal and ethical questions surrounding ownership of these objects remain contentious even today, with ongoing disputes about who rightfully owns various artworks and artifacts that changed hands during the war years. Hitler's vehicles occupy an interesting position in these debates. Unlike stolen artwork or cultural treasures that belonged to museums or private individuals before the war, Hitler's cars were built specifically for him and the Nazi state. There are no pre-war owners seeking their return. The primary legal question is whether Allied soldiers and officers who claimed these vehicles as war trophies were acting within their authority, or whether they were, in effect, stealing government property. Different countries had different regulations about war booty, and interpretations of those regulations varied widely in the chaos of the immediate post-war period. Some Hitler Mercedes were properly documented as captured enemy property and transferred through official military channels. Others simply disappeared into private hands through processes that were, at best, irregular and at worst, outright theft. Sorting out these complex ownership histories decades after the fact has proven nearly impossible in many cases, leading to situations where the current legal ownership of some vehicles remains unclear or contested. The cultural impact of Hitler's vehicles extends beyond museums and collectors into popular culture, where these cars have made appearances in films, documentaries, and even video games. Hollywood has occasionally featured Mercedes-Benz 770K vehicles in World War II films, though not always actual Hitler cars. The vehicle's dramatic appearance and historical associations make them visually striking props that instantly communicate Nazi power and menace to audiences. Some films have gone to considerable lengths to obtain authentic 770K vehicles for filming, while others have used replicas or modified similar vehicles to create the desired visual effect. Documentary filmmakers have faced ethical questions when featuring Hitler's actual vehicles, trying to balance the educational value of showing these objects with concerns about inadvertently glorifying their former owner. The most thoughtful documentaries use footage of the vehicles as starting points for broader discussions about propaganda, power, and historical memory, rather than simply presenting them as fascinating curiosities. Video game developers creating World War II games have included virtual versions of Hitler's Mercedes, allowing players to see detailed three-dimensional recreations of these historical vehicles. While these digital representations raise fewer ethical concerns than physical displays, they still prompt questions about how history should be represented in entertainment media and whether such details risk trivializing serious historical events. The economic value of Hitler's vehicles has fluctuated over time, reflecting changing attitudes toward Nazi memorabilia and broader trends in the collector car market. In the immediate post-war years, these vehicles had relatively little monetary value, as there was limited interest in collecting Nazi-related items, and the world was still processing the trauma of the war. By the 1960s and 1970s, as World War II became more distant history and collecting Nazi memorabilia became more common, prices for Hitler vehicles began to rise. A Hitler Mercedes that might have sold for a few $1,000s in the 1950s could fetch $50,000 or more by the 1970s. The 1980s and 1990s saw dramatic increases in value, with well-documented Hitler vehicles selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The new millennium brought even more spectacular prices, with the most desirable vehicles commanding millions of dollars at auction and in private sales. This price appreciation has created a perverse situation where the vehicles have become more valuable precisely because of their association with Hitler, rewarding those who acquired them decades ago and creating incentives for fraud and misrepresentation. However, there are signs that this market may have peaked. Recent attempts to sell Hitler Mercedes have sometimes failed to attract buyers at expected prices, suggesting that collectors may be becoming more cautious about acquiring such controversial objects. Whether this represents a permanent shift or merely a temporary fluctuation in an unusual market remains to be seen. The Mercedes-Benz 770K vehicles built for Hitler represent the intersection of several different historical narratives. They are artifacts of automotive history, examples of cutting-edge 1930s engineering and design. They are relics of Nazi Germany, physical embodiments of the regime's power and propaganda machinery. They are witnesses to the Holocaust, having transported the man who ordered the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. They are symbols of Allied victory, captured trophies that represent the defeat of Nazi Germany. And they are objects of ongoing controversy, focal points for debates about how societies should remember difficult histories. Each of these narratives is valid, and together they create a complex and sometimes contradictory story that resists simple interpretation. A Hitler Mercedes is simultaneously a beautiful machine and an object of horror, a priceless historical artifact and a potentially dangerous symbol, something worth preserving and something that perhaps should never have been preserved. Living with these contradictions requires nuance and thoughtfulness, qualities that have not always been present in discussions about these vehicles. One of the most interesting Hitler Mercedes still in existence is currently housed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. This vehicle, a 1940 Mercedes-Benz 770K, has a particularly well-documented history. The car was captured by American forces in Berchtesgaden in May 1945 and was subsequently used by senior American military officers for official transportation during the occupation of Germany. In this capacity, the vehicle that had once carried Hitler through conquered territories was repurposed to carry the officers who had defeated him, a symbolic reversal that was not lost on observers at the time. After several years of use by occupation authorities, the car was shipped to the United States and eventually made its way to the Air Force Museum, where it has been displayed since the 1970s. The museum presents the vehicle in the context of American military victory, emphasizing the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Allied occupation. Visitors can view the car alongside other World War II artifacts, including aircraft, weapons, and military equipment. The museum's interpretive materials discuss Hitler's use of vehicles for propaganda and the symbolic significance of American forces capturing and repurposing his personal cars. This approach frames the vehicle as a symbol of American victory rather than as Hitler's car per se, an interpretive choice that attempts to redirect focus away from Hitler himself and toward the broader story of the war and its outcome. Another fascinating vehicle currently resides at the Museum of the Surrender at Karlshorst in Berlin, Germany. This institution, located in the building where the German Instrument of Surrender was signed on, May 8, 1945, specializes in the history of the Soviet-German War and Germany's defeat. The Mercedes displayed there is a 1939 770K that was captured by Soviet forces and remained in Soviet custody until after the Cold War ended. The vehicle was returned to Germany in the 1990s and was transferred to the Karlshorst Museum, which presents it in the context of Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. The museum's approach reflects a particularly German sensitivity to these objects, with extensive educational materials explaining the vehicle's role in Nazi propaganda and its capture as a symbol of the regime's defeat. German visitors, many of whom have family members who experienced the war firsthand, often have strong emotional reactions to seeing the car. The museum has documented these reactions as part of its ongoing effort to understand how Germans relate to their country's difficult history and how artifacts like Hitler's vehicles fit into contemporary German historical consciousness. The presence of this vehicle in Berlin, the city where Hitler used it most frequently and where he ultimately died, creates a particularly powerful historical resonance that the museum attempts to leverage for educational purposes. The Imperial War Museum in London took a different approach when it acquired a Hitler Mercedes in 1975. Rather than displaying the vehicle prominently, the museum kept it in storage for many years, uncertain about how to present it to the British public. Museum officials worried that displaying Hitler's car might be seen as glorifying the Nazi leader or trivializing the suffering of those who had endured the Blitz and other German attacks on Britain. However, they also recognized that the vehicle was an important historical artifact that could help tell the story of World War II and Nazi Germany. After considerable internal debate and consultation with Holocaust survivors and historians, the museum developed an approach that involved displaying the vehicle, only occasionally in special exhibitions devoted to specific aspects of World War II history. When shown, the car is always presented with extensive contextual materials and is explicitly framed as an example of Nazi propaganda rather than as an impressive automobile. This cautious, context-heavy approach reflects a particularly British sensibility about how to handle controversial historical objects, one that prioritizes educational value while remaining acutely aware of the potential for misunderstanding or offense. The story of Hitler's missing Mercedes has attracted the attention of treasure hunters and amateur historians who believe that some of the unaccounted-for vehicles might still be hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. Over the years, numerous searches have been conducted, particularly in areas of Germany where Nazi leaders might have hidden valuable assets as the war drew to a close. The area around Berchtesgaden, with its numerous tunnels, bunkers and remote mountain locations, has been a particular focus of such searches. Treasure hunters have investigated abandoned bunkers, explored old mine shafts and followed up on rumours and legends about hidden Nazi caches. While these searches have occasionally turned up interesting artifacts, including some vintage vehicles, none has yet produced a confirmed Hitler Mercedes that was not previously known to exist. Most experts are skeptical that any significant number of Hitler's vehicles remain hidden, believing that the cars were too large and too recognizable to have been successfully concealed for 80 years. However, the romantic appeal of discovering a hidden piece of history keeps treasure hunters searching, and occasionally a credible lead emerges that suggests the possibility that at least one or two vehicles might indeed have been successfully hidden. One persistent legend involves a Hitler Mercedes that was supposedly hidden in a salt mine in Austria in the final days of the war. Salt mines were used by Nazi officials to store artworks, gold and other valuables during the war's closing months, and Allied forces did indeed discover significant caches of stolen art and treasure in several Austrian salt mines in 1945. According to the legend, a Mercedes was hidden along with these other valuables but was somehow overlooked during the initial Allied investigations. The story has been investigated several times over the years, but no evidence has ever been found to support it. Most historians believe the legend is either entirely false or based on confusion about a different vehicle that was actually found. Nevertheless, the story persists in treasure hunting circles and occasionally inspires new searches of Austrian salt mines and storage facilities. Such legends highlight the enduring fascination with Hitler's missing possessions and the persistent hope that major historical discoveries remain to be made. The fate of Hitler's Mercedes has implications that extend beyond these specific vehicles to broader questions about how societies preserve and interpret difficult histories. The vehicles serve as case studies for museum professionals, historians, and policymakers grappling with similar issues involving other controversial artifacts. How should museums display objects associated with perpetrators of mass atrocity? What responsibility do collectors have when acquiring items connected to historical evil? When, if ever, is destruction of historically significant objects justified on ethical grounds? These questions have no universally accepted answers, and different societies and institutions continue to work through them in different ways. Hitler's vehicles, because of their visibility and the passionate debates they generate, often serve as focal points for these larger discussions. Symposia and conferences on museum ethics frequently include sessions discussing the appropriate handling of Hitler memorabilia, and the various approaches taken by different institutions toward Hitler's cars are studied as examples of different ethical frameworks in action. Educational uses of Hitler's vehicles have evolved significantly over the decades. Early displays in the 1940s and 1950s often presented the cars with minimal context, assuming that visitors would understand their significance without extensive explanation. As Holocaust education became more sophisticated and as museums developed more nuanced approaches to interpreting difficult histories, displays of Hitler's vehicles became more contextually rich and educationally focused. Modern exhibits typically include extensive information about the Holocaust, Nazi propaganda techniques, the war's impact on civilian populations, and the importance of resisting totalitarianism. Some museums use the vehicles as part of broader programs that bring together Holocaust survivors, educators, and students for discussions about history, memory, and moral responsibility. The Canadian War Museum, for instance, has hosted programs where survivors share their stories in the presence of Hitler's car, creating powerful juxtapositions between the vehicle that symbolized Nazi power and the human voices of those who suffered under that power. These programs transform the vehicle from a mere object into a catalyst for meaningful engagement with history and its lessons. The conservation challenges posed by Hitler's vehicles have created unusual collaborations between automotive historians, museum conservators, and specialists in metalwork, upholstery, and other crafts. Preserving these cars requires expertise in 1930s German automotive technology, knowledge of period materials and construction techniques, and understanding of how armoured vehicles age and deteriorate. Some institutions have formed partnerships with Mercedes-Benz, drawing on the company's historical archives and technical expertise. Others have worked with specialized restoration shops that focus on pre-war luxury automobiles. The conservation work itself raises interesting questions about authenticity and appropriate levels of intervention. Should conservators attempt to arrest further deterioration while leaving the vehicle in its current state? Should they restore damaged or deteriorated components using period-appropriate methods and materials? Or should they focus primarily on documentation, creating detailed records of the vehicle's current condition without extensive physical intervention? Different institutions have adopted different philosophies, reflecting broader debates within the conservation field about the goals and methods of preserving historical objects. The environmental impact of preserving Hitler's vehicles is an often overlooked aspect of their story. These massive machines are not environmentally friendly by any modern standard. Their engines consume fuel at alarming rates and produce emissions that would be illegal under current environmental regulations. Even when not running, the vehicles require climate-controlled storage facilities that consume substantial energy to maintain appropriate temperature and humidity levels. Some environmental activists have argued that destroying the vehicles would be the most ecologically responsible course of action, eliminating the energy costs associated with their preservation and storage. However, this argument has gained little traction among museum professionals and historians, who generally view the historical and educational value of the vehicles as outweighing environmental concerns. Nevertheless, the issue highlights how even the seemingly straightforward question of preserving historical artifacts intersects with contemporary concerns about sustainability and environmental responsibility. Some institutions have sought to reduce the environmental impact of storing Hitler vehicles by using more efficient climate control systems or by locating the vehicles in naturally climate-controlled environments like certain underground storage facilities. The psychological impact of encountering Hitler's vehicles should not be underestimated. For many people, particularly Holocaust survivors and their descendants, seeing one of these cars can trigger powerful emotional responses. Museums that display Hitler Mercedes often provide warnings about the potentially disturbing nature of the exhibit, allowing sensitive visitors to avoid the area if they choose. Some institutions have created quiet spaces near exhibits featuring Hitler's vehicles where visitors can process their emotions and reflections. Psychologists who study collective memory and trauma have documented the range of reactions people have to these objects. Some visitors report feeling angry or disturbed by the vehicle's existence, struggling with the fact that such evil is represented by something as beautiful and well-crafted as a luxury automobile. Others describe a kind of cognitive dissonance, finding themselves inadvertently admiring the engineering and design while feeling guilty about that admiration given the vehicle's history. Still, others report that seeing the actual physical object makes the abstract history of the Nazi era feel more real and immediate, helping them connect emotionally with events that might otherwise seem distant or theoretical. These varied responses demonstrate the complex psychological work that historical artifacts can perform, serving as touchstones that help people engage with difficult pasts in personal and meaningful ways. The role of photography in shaping perceptions of Hitler's vehicles deserves attention. The Nazi regime was masterful at using photography for propaganda purposes, and countless images exist of Hitler in his Mercedes, carefully staged to project power, approachability, or whatever other quality the propagandists wished to emphasize. These historical photographs continue to shape how people view the actual vehicles today. When museum visitors see a Hitler Mercedes, they often mentally superimpose images from these propaganda photographs, imagining Hitler standing in the car saluting crowds or riding through conquered cities. This layering of historical imagery onto physical objects creates a complex viewing experience where the artifact serves not just as itself, but as a trigger for historical memory and imagination. Some museums have deliberately incorporated historical photographs into their displays of Hitler vehicles, showing visitors the original propaganda images alongside the actual cars. This approach helps viewers understand how these vehicles functioned as propaganda tools, while also critically examining the visual techniques used to create powerful political imagery. Other institutions have chosen to display the vehicles without accompanying photographs, hoping to allow visitors to encounter the objects themselves without the mediation of historical images. Each approach reflects different theories about how people learn from historical artifacts and how museums can best facilitate meaningful engagement with difficult histories. The question of what will happen to Hitler's vehicles in the future as direct memory of World War II and the Holocaust fades with the passing of the last generation who experienced these events firsthand is increasingly urgent. Some scholars worry that without living witnesses to the atrocities committed by Hitler and the Nazi regime, these vehicles might be recontextualized in problematic ways, potentially becoming mere curiosities or even objects of admiration divorced from their terrible history. This concern has led some institutions to create extensive multimedia documentation of Holocaust survivor testimony and other first-hand accounts that can be preserved alongside the vehicles, ensuring that future generations will have access not just to the objects, but to the voices of those who experience the era they represent. Other museums have developed educational programs specifically designed for young people who have no personal connection to World War II, using the vehicles as entry points for discussions about the continuing relevance of lessons from that period. These programs often connect historical events to contemporary issues like the dangers of demagogic leadership, the importance of resisting propaganda, and the need to stand up against hatred and persecution. By drawing these connections, educators hope to keep the lessons of the Nazi era alive for future generations who will rely on objects like Hitler's vehicles as their primary tangible links to that history. The intersection of Hitler's vehicles with the digital revolution has created new preservation challenges and opportunities. High-resolution three-dimensional scanning technology now allows museums to create incredibly detailed digital models of these vehicles, capturing every curve, dent, and detail. These digital models can be preserved indefinitely and can be accessed by researchers and the public worldwide without requiring physical access to the actual vehicles. Some institutions have made their scans publicly available, allowing anyone with appropriate software to examine Hitler's vehicles virtually. This democratization of access has educational benefits, but also raises concerns about how these digital models might be used. Could someone use a scan to create a replica vehicle? Might the scans be used in ways that glorify Hitler or the Nazi regime? These questions have led some museums to restrict access to their digital scans, or to release them only with clear usage restrictions. Virtual reality technology adds another dimension to this issue, allowing people to experience what it might have been like to sit in Hitler's car or ride in it through virtual simulations. While such simulations could have educational value, helping people understand the experience of Nazi rallies and propaganda from a new perspective, they also risk creating troubling immersive experiences that might be seen as glorifying or trivializing history. Museums and technology developers are still working through how to navigate these new possibilities responsibly. The story of Hitler's missing Mercedes also touches on the broader phenomenon of dark tourism, the practice of visiting sites and viewing objects associated with death, suffering, and atrocity. Hitler's vehicles are undeniably dark tourism objects, artifacts that attract visitors precisely because of their association with one of history's greatest monsters. Research on dark tourism suggests that people are drawn to such sites and objects for complex reasons, including morbid curiosity, desire to pay respects to victims, educational motivations, and the thrill of encountering something taboo or transgressive. Museums displaying Hitler's vehicles must navigate these varying visitor motivations, designing exhibits that discourage voyeuristic fascination while encouraging thoughtful engagement with history. Some institutions have addressed this challenge by making access to Hitler vehicle displays deliberately difficult or uncomfortable, requiring visitors to pass through exhibits about Nazi atrocities before reaching the vehicles themselves. This approach ensures that anyone viewing the cars has first been confronted with information about the suffering caused by the regime they represented. Other museums have taken the opposite approach, making the vehicles easily accessible, but surrounding them with so much educational material that the cars become almost secondary to the broader historical narrative being presented. Both strategies attempt to channel visitor interest in productive directions, while acknowledging the powerful pull that objects associated with Hitler exert on many people. The comparative history of how different types of Hitler artifacts have been treated provides useful context for understanding the story of his vehicles. Hitler's personal possessions, ranging from mundane items like clothing and dishware to more significant objects like artwork and furniture, have been dispersed widely and have been treated very differently by different individuals and institutions. Some objects have been destroyed, particularly items seen as having little historical value and significant potential for misuse. Others have been preserved in museums alongside extensive contextual information. Still, others have entered the commercial market, bought and sold by collectors with varying motivations. Interestingly, vehicles seem to occupy a middle ground in these discussions. They are more acceptable than some items, like Hitler's personal clothing or household objects, which many people feel should not be preserved or displayed. But they are less acceptable than documentary materials like letters and official documents, which are generally agreed to have clear historical and research value. This intermediate status reflects the dual nature of Hitler's vehicles as both functional objects that happen to be owned by Hitler and as purpose-built symbols of Nazi power. This duality makes them particularly interesting but also particularly contentious, as reasonable people can disagree about whether their functional or symbolic nature should predominate in decisions about their disposition. Financial institutions and legal systems have had to develop new approaches to handling Hitler's vehicles as valuable assets. When these cars are used as collateral for loans included in estate settlements or involved in divorce proceedings, standard procedures must be adapted to account for their unusual nature. Insurance appraisers must determine values for objects whose worth depends partly on controversial historical associations. Estate attorneys must advise executors on how to dispose of vehicles that potential heirs might not want to inherit despite their monetary value. Divorce lawyers have handled cases where Hitler vehicles were significant marital assets that had to be divided or valued. In at least one documented case, a divorcing couple fought over who would get custody of a Hitler Mercedes that had been a major investment during their marriage, with both parties torn between the vehicle's substantial financial value and discomfort with owning such an object. The judge in that case ultimately ordered the car sold and the proceeds divided, noting that neither party seemed genuinely eager to keep it. Such cases illustrate how Hitler's vehicles have become entangled in the ordinary machinery of modern life, creating awkward intersections between historical horror and mundane legal and financial processes. The role of authentication experts and historians in verifying claims about Hitler's vehicles has become increasingly important as the potential value of these cars has grown. A small group of specialists, including automotive historians, archivists familiar with Nazi-era records, and experts in the specific details of Mercedes-Benz 770K vehicles, are regularly called upon to evaluate whether particular cars genuinely belong to Hitler. These experts have developed sophisticated methodologies combining documentary research, forensic examination, and photographic analysis. Their verdicts can make the difference between a vehicle being worth millions of dollars or merely tens of thousands, creating enormous pressure to get the assessment right. Some authentication experts have been sued by sellers or buyers unhappy with their conclusions, leading to legal battles over expert qualifications and methodology. The field has developed ethical guidelines intended to ensure that authentication decisions are based on evidence rather than financial incentives, though conflicts of interest remain a concern given the large sums of money involved. The work of these experts represents a specialized form of historical detective work, piecing together fragmentary evidence to determine the truth about specific objects' pasts. Their findings contribute not just to market valuations, but to our broader understanding of Hitler's relationship with automobiles and the Nazi regime's use of vehicles for propaganda and transportation. The environmental conditions in which Hitler's vehicles have been stored over the decades have significantly affected their current condition. Some vehicles spent years exposed to weather and neglect before being recognized as historically significant, resulting in rust, deterioration of interior materials, and mechanical degradation. Others were carefully preserved from the moment of their capture, maintaining much of their original condition. These differences in preservation history create variations in current value and usability that can be as significant as variations in provenance. A Hitler Mercedes that spent 30 years rusting in a field is fundamentally different from one that was immediately placed in climate-controlled storage, regardless of whether both were genuinely Hitler's personal vehicles. Conservators working with these cars must understand not just the vehicle's original construction, but also their subsequent history of use, neglect, and prior restoration attempts. Sometimes evidence of this post-Hitler history is as historically significant as evidence of the vehicle's use during the Nazi era. Damage from Allied bombing, modifications made by occupation forces, or deterioration from decades of poor storage all tell stories about what happened to these objects after their original purpose ended. Some conservators argue for preserving this evidence of the vehicle's post-war lives rather than attempting to restore them to their original 1940s condition, viewing the cars as palimpsests that bear multiple layers of historical meaning. The comparative experiences of different countries in dealing with Hitler's vehicles reveal interesting cultural differences in how societies process difficult histories. American institutions have generally been more comfortable with commercial transactions involving Hitler memorabilia, reflecting a cultural emphasis on free markets and free speech. European institutions, particularly in Germany and Austria, have taken more restrictive approaches reflecting legal frameworks and cultural attitudes shaped by proximity to Nazi atrocities. Israeli institutions have been notably absent from this story, with no known Hitler vehicles in Israeli collections, reflecting a collective decision that such objects should not be present in the Jewish state. These different national approaches demonstrate that there is no single correct way to handle artifacts associated with historical evil. Rather, different societies make different choices based on their specific histories, values, and legal frameworks. The international circulation of Hitler's vehicles, moving between countries with different approaches to Nazi memorabilia, highlights the challenges of creating consistent global standards for handling such objects. The academic study of Hitler's vehicles has produced a small but significant body of scholarly literature examining these objects from various disciplinary perspectives. Historians have analyzed the vehicles as artifacts of Nazi propaganda and symbols of totalitarian power. Art historians have studied their design and aesthetics, examining how their appearance was calculated to project specific messages about German technological superiority and Nazi grandeur. Sociologists have investigated how different groups relate to these objects and what the debates surrounding them reveal about collective memory and cultural attitudes toward difficult histories. Material culture scholars have examined the vehicles as examples of how objects can carry meanings that extend far beyond their functional purposes. This academic attention has helped develop more sophisticated frameworks for understanding Hitler's vehicles and similar contested artifacts. Research findings from these studies inform museum practice, guide authentication efforts, and contribute to broader discussions about heritage preservation and historical memory. The vehicles serve as case studies that help scholars develop theories applicable to other controversial historical objects, from Confederate monuments in the United States to colonial artifacts in European museums. In this way, Hitler's missing Mercedes have contributed to intellectual work that extends far beyond their specific story, helping scholars and the public think more carefully about the complex relationships between objects, history, and memory. The technical specifications of Hitler's Mercedes-Benz 770K vehicles included numerous custom features that distinguished them from even other luxury vehicles of the era. The specially designed running boards, wider than standard to accommodate SS bodyguards, were reinforced to support the weight of multiple armed men while the vehicle was in motion. The windshields could be completely lowered into the body, allowing Hitler to stand fully visible during parades while still having weather protection available when needed. The vehicles included multiple flag staff mounts positioned at specific angles to ensure that Nazi flags would display properly when the car was moving. The interiors featured custom seating configurations designed to accommodate Hitler's specific preferences, including a specially designed seat that could be adjusted to different heights, allowing him to stand at the optimal level for saluting crowds. Communication equipment included not just radio but also telephone connections that could be linked to landlines when the vehicle was stationary, allowing Hitler to conduct government business from his car. The tyres were specially manufactured by several different companies competing for contracts, with each developing proprietary compounds claimed to offer superior puncture resistance and longevity. The electrical systems included backup batteries to ensure that critical functions would continue even if the main battery failed. Every detail of these vehicles represented the peak of 1930s automotive technology applied without concern for cost. The question of whether replicas of Hitler's vehicles should be permitted has generated its own set of controversies. Several companies and individuals have built replica 770K vehicles over the years, some accurate to the original specifications and others loosely based on the general design. These replicas serve various purposes. Some are built for film production, allowing movie makers to include historically accurate vehicles in their productions without risking damage to authentic artifacts. Others are constructed by automotive enthusiasts interested in the technical challenges of replicating 1930s engineering. A few have been built specifically to replicate Hitler's cars, complete with Nazi insignia and special features like the wide running boards. These Hitler-specific replicas have sparked debates similar to those surrounding the authentic vehicles. Critics argue that building replicas of Hitler's cars serves no legitimate purpose and amounts to glorifying the Nazi leader. Supporters counter that replicas allow more people to see what these historically significant vehicles look like without putting authentic artifacts at risk. Some jurisdictions have restricted the display of Nazi symbols on replica vehicles, while others allow them under certain conditions. The existence of replicas also complicates authentication efforts, as unscrupulous sellers have occasionally attempted to pass off replicas as authentic vehicles, particularly in jurisdictions where potential buyers might have limited access to expert authentication services. The evolution of public opinion about Hitler's vehicles over the 8 decades since World War II reflects broader changes in how societies remember and interpret the Nazi era. In the immediate post-war years, the vehicles were seen primarily as trophies of victory, symbols of a defeated enemy that could be displayed with satisfaction. By the 1960s and 1970s, as the Holocaust became more central to public understanding of the Nazi era, attitudes began to shift toward discomfort with preserving or displaying objects so closely associated with Hitler. The 1980s and 1990s saw increasing sophistication in how museums and educators approached these artifacts, developing interpretive frameworks that acknowledge their historical significance, while contextualizing them within the broader story of Nazi crimes. The 21st century has brought new challenges, as the rise of far-right movements in various countries has renewed concerns about how Nazi symbols and artifacts might be appropriated for contemporary political purposes. This evolving context has required institutions possessing Hitler's vehicles to continually reassess their approaches to display and interpretation, adapting to changing social sensitivities and political realities. Museums that displayed these cars with minimal context in the 1950s have had to develop increasingly elaborate interpretive frameworks to justify their continued preservation and exhibition. This ongoing evolution demonstrates that historical artifacts are not static objects whose meaning is fixed. Rather, they are dynamic elements whose significance changes as societies change and as our understanding of history develops. One particularly interesting vehicle that has surfaced in recent years is a Mercedes that was reportedly used by Hitler during his occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939. This vehicle, a 1938 770K, was allegedly captured by Czech resistance fighters near the end of the war and hidden in a rural area of Bohemia. The car was supposedly discovered in the 1990s after the fall of communism allowed more open discussion of wartime events. Czech historians have investigated the vehicle and concluded that while it is definitely an authentic 770K from the correct period and shows evidence of having been used by high-ranking Nazi officials, conclusively proving that Hitler personally used it has been difficult. Photographic evidence shows vehicles very similar to this one in Hitler's motorcade during his triumphal entry into Prague in March 1939. But the quality of period photographs makes definitive identification challenging. The vehicle's current location has been kept relatively secret, with its owners apparently preferring to avoid the controversy that would come with public display or sale. This case illustrates the complex detective work required to authenticate these vehicles and the often incomplete or ambiguous nature of the historical evidence available. The role of Hitler's vehicles in Holocaust education programs deserves particular attention. Some educators have found that these tangible objects can serve as powerful entry points for teaching about the Holocaust and World War II, particularly for students who struggle to connect with abstract historical narratives. The vehicles make history concrete, providing a physical object that students can examine and discuss. However, using Hitler's cars in educational settings requires careful planning and skilled facilitation. Educators must ensure that students understand the vehicles as symbols of Nazi power and propaganda, rather than as impressive machines worthy of admiration. Programs that have successfully incorporated Hitler's vehicles into Holocaust education typically include several key elements. They begin with extensive background about the Holocaust and Nazi persecution before introducing the vehicle. They use the car as a starting point for discussing propaganda techniques and how symbols of power function. They include testimony from Holocaust survivors or other witnesses who can provide human perspectives on the era. And they conclude with reflection exercises that help students process what they have learned and connect it to contemporary issues. When done well, such programs can be powerful educational experiences. When done poorly, they risk trivializing the Holocaust or inadvertently conveying inappropriate fascination with Nazi symbols and technology. The international trade in Hitler memorabilia, of which vehicles form a small but high-value component, has grown substantially over recent decades despite ongoing controversies. Online auction sites, specialized dealers, and private networks facilitate the buying and selling of Nazi-related items globally. This market exists in a complex legal and ethical landscape, with different countries imposing different restrictions on the sale of such materials. Some nations, particularly Germany and Austria, severely restrict or prohibit the commercial trade in Nazi memorabilia. Others, including the United States, allow relatively free trade while relying on market mechanisms and public opinion to regulate what is acceptable. The result is an international market that operates partially above ground and partially in grey areas where legal status is unclear. Hitler's vehicles, being extremely high-value items that cannot be easily moved or hidden, tend to exist more in the legitimate market than smaller items of Nazi memorabilia. However, they are still affected by the broader controversies surrounding this trade. Sellers must navigate complex questions about appropriate venues for sales, acceptable marketing approaches, and responsible selection of buyers. Buyers must consider not just the vehicle's historical and monetary value, but also the reputational and ethical implications of ownership. This has led to a market characterized by discretion, with many transactions occurring privately rather than through public auctions, and with buyers often preferring to remain anonymous. The technical challenges of operating Hitler's vehicles in the modern era are substantial. These cars were designed for 1930s roads and traffic conditions, with mechanical specifications that made sense in that context but create problems today. The vehicles lack modern safety features like seatbelts, airbags, anti-lock brakes, and crumple zones. Their braking systems, while adequate for 1930s speeds, are marginal by modern standards, particularly given the enormous weight of the armoured versions. The steering systems lack power assistance, making the cars difficult to manoeuvre at low speeds. The lighting systems use old-fashioned bulb technology that provides illumination far inferior to modern headlights. These factors mean that driving Hitler's Mercedes on modern roads would be dangerous both for occupants and for other road users. Most institutions and collectors that own operational vehicles drive them only in controlled environments like museum grounds or at special automotive events where speeds are low and other vehicles are absent. The few times these cars have been driven on public roads in recent decades have typically required special permits and police escorts. This practical limitation reinforces arguments that these vehicles should primarily be preserved as static displays rather than as operational historical vehicles. The symbolism of Hitler's vehicles extends beyond their association with the Nazi leader himself to represent broader themes and historical patterns. The cars symbolize how technology can be deployed in service of evil, demonstrating that advanced engineering and beautiful design do not inherently serve good purposes. They represent the Nazi regime's skill at propaganda and image management, showing how material objects were carefully deployed to project power and inspire loyalty or fear. They embody the enormous resources that were devoted to maintaining Hitler's personal comfort and security, even as ordinary Germans suffered deprivation. And they serve as reminders of the vast gulf between Nazi leaders' lifestyles and the conditions endured by those they persecuted and murdered. Holocaust museums and educators have used these symbolic dimensions of the vehicles to teach broader lessons about totalitarianism, propaganda, and the dangers of unchecked power. When presented thoughtfully, Hitler's Mercedes can help students and museum visitors understand not just specific historical events, but larger patterns of how authoritarian regimes function and how ordinary people can be complicit in or resist such systems. The question of how Hitler's vehicles should be described in museum labels, auction catalogues, and other public documents has generated considerable debate. What language should be used to refer to Hitler? Should he be called the Führer, using the title he claimed? Should he be identified simply as German leader or chancellor, using neutral political terminology? Should descriptive phrases like dictator or mass murderer be included? Different institutions have reached different conclusions about appropriate terminology. Some use formal language that maintains historical distance, referring to Hitler by his political title and avoiding explicitly judgmental language. Others deliberately use terms that emphasize his crimes, describing him as a dictator responsible for genocide and world war. These choices reflect different philosophies about the role of museums and educational institutions. Those favoring neutral language argue that presenting historical facts without editorializing allows visitors to draw their own conclusions and maintains institutional credibility. Those favoring explicitly critical language contend that moral clarity is essential when dealing with perpetrators of mass atrocity, and that seeming neutrality can be misinterpreted as ambivalence about Nazi crimes. The debate has intensified in recent years as some have argued that rising far-right movements require more explicit institutional statements opposing Nazi ideology, rather than assuming that such opposition is obvious. The scientific and forensic examination of Hitler's vehicles has revealed fascinating details about their construction and use. Chemical analysis of paint samples has helped authenticate vehicles by matching original factory paint formulations. Metallurgical testing of armor plating has provided information about German armoring technology in the 1930s. Analysis of upholstery materials and interior fittings has revealed details about luxury automobile construction practices of the era. Forensic examination of wear patterns on pedals, steering wheels, and seats has provided clues about how extensively different vehicles were used. In some cases, microscopic examination has revealed biological traces like hair or skin cells that could potentially be subjected to DNA testing, though most institutions have deemed such testing unnecessary or inappropriate. Historians studying German automotive industry records have cross-referenced vehicle identification numbers with production logs to track the manufacture and delivery of specific cars. This scientific and documentary research has built a detailed picture of how these vehicles were built, used, and dispersed after the war. The research has also helped identify fraudulent claims and authenticate genuine vehicles, contributing to both historical knowledge and market transparency. The relationship between Hitler's vehicles and the broader automotive collecting hobby is complex and sometimes uncomfortable. Classic car enthusiasts appreciate the 770K for its engineering excellence and historical significance, regardless of political associations. However, the presence of Hitler vehicles at automotive events and in car collecting circles has sometimes created tensions. Some collectors and event organizers feel that including Hitler's cars alongside other classic automobiles normalizes them and obscures their dark history. Others argue that excluding them based on former ownership creates an arbitrary standard and denies the historical reality that these were significant automobiles of their era. Most prestigious automotive events have developed policies allowing Hitler vehicles to be displayed, but requiring appropriate contextual information to be included. Some events have experimented with creating separate areas for historically controversial vehicles, allowing attendees to view them if they choose, but not mixing them with other classic cars. These compromises reflect attempts to balance appreciation for automotive history with sensitivity to the vehicle's associations with mass murder and genocide. The debates within the car collecting community mirror larger social debates about how to handle controversial historical artifacts. The economics of preserving Hitler's vehicles extend beyond simple ownership to include ongoing maintenance, insurance, security, and opportunity costs of capital and space. Museums housing these vehicles must allocate significant resources to their care, resources that could alternatively be spent on other educational programs or artifacts. Private owners face substantial annual costs for storage, insurance, and maintenance that can run into tens of thousands of dollars. These economic realities have led some individuals and institutions to question whether the expense of preserving Hitler's vehicles is justified. Critics point out that the same resources could support multiple other historical preservation projects or educational programs. Supporters respond that these vehicles' unique historical significance justifies the expense and that their preservation serves important educational purposes that benefit society. Some institutions have sought to offset costs by using Hitler vehicles as centerpieces for major exhibitions that attract visitors and generate revenue. However, this approach risks appearing to profit from Hitler's notoriety, creating new ethical concerns. The economics dimensions of preservation illustrate how decisions about historical artifacts are never purely academic or educational, but always involve practical considerations about resource allocation and institutional priorities. The legal status of Hitler's vehicles in terms of cultural heritage and patrimony laws varies by jurisdiction. Some countries consider significant historical artifacts to be part of national heritage that cannot be freely exported. Others treat these objects as private property subject to normal commerce laws. Germany, somewhat paradoxically, does not claim Hitler's vehicles as German cultural heritage that should be repatriated, apparently viewing these artifacts as uncomfortable reminders of a shameful past rather than treasures to be preserved. The United States has generally treated Hitler vehicles as private property that can be bought, sold, and exported with few restrictions. This has created a situation where the majority of known Hitler vehicles are now outside Germany, dispersed among museums and collectors in North America, Europe, and beyond. Some German scholars and cultural heritage advocates have expressed regret about this dispersal, arguing that these vehicles are important parts of German history that should be in German institutions where they can be properly contextualized within the broader narrative of German responsibility for Nazi crimes. Others are content to have these controversial objects located elsewhere, feeling that their presence in Germany might attract neo-Nazi sympathizers or create diplomatic complications. These debates reflect broader questions about cultural heritage, historical responsibility, and the appropriate location for objects associated with national shame. The connection between Hitler's vehicles and broader patterns of luxury goods consumption by Nazi leaders provides important historical context. Hitler and other top Nazi officials enjoyed lavish lifestyles funded by looted property, slave labor, and the German state. Hitler's Mercedes were just one component of a much larger pattern of luxury consumption that included palatial residences, extensive art collections, fine wines and foods, and other expensive goods. This conspicuous consumption occurred even as ordinary Germans faced shortages and rationing, and while millions of Jews and others were being systematically murdered. Historians have documented the hypocrisy and moral corruption this represents, showing how Nazi leaders enriched themselves while claiming to serve higher ideological purposes. Hitler's vehicles serve as evidence of this pattern, physical manifestations of the gulf between Nazi rhetoric about sacrifice and service and the reality of leaders' privileged lives. Educational programs that discuss the vehicles often incorporate this broader context, helping visitors understand that the cars were not just transportation, but symbols of a corrupt system built on theft, exploitation, and mass murder. This contextualization helps prevent the vehicles from being admired simply as beautiful machines, instead positioning them within the larger story of Nazi crimes and moral bankruptcy. The future of Hitler's vehicles depends partly on decisions being made now about their preservation, documentation, and accessibility. Museums and collectors currently possessing these vehicles must consider how they will be passed to future generations. Digital preservation techniques offer the possibility of creating comprehensive records that will survive even if the physical vehicles eventually deteriorate beyond repair. Some institutions have created virtual exhibitions that allow online visitors from around the world to explore Hitler's vehicles without requiring physical travel to museums. These digital initiatives democratize access while also creating permanent records that will outlast the physical artifacts. However, digital preservation raises its own questions about appropriate access and use. Should virtual models of Hitler's vehicles be freely available for anyone to download and use, or should access be restricted to ensure the digital representations are not misused? Should virtual reality experiences of riding in Hitler's cars be created for educational purposes, or would such simulations trivialize history and create inappropriate immersive experiences? These questions will become increasingly important as virtual and augmented reality technologies advance and as physical artifacts continue to age. The comparison between how Hitler's vehicles have been treated and how other controversial historical artifacts have been handled is illuminating. Confederate monuments in the United States, colonial statues in Europe, artifacts from slavery and objects associated with other historical atrocities have all generated similar debates about preservation, removal, contextualization, and destruction. Some common themes emerge across these different cases. There is often tension between those who view controversial objects primarily as historical evidence, deserving preservation, and those who see them primarily as offensive symbols that should be removed or destroyed. Questions arise about who has the authority to make decisions about such objects and whose voices should be prioritized in debates about their fate. There are difficult discussions about the difference between preserving history and glorifying it, between education and trauma, between remembering and moving on. Hitler's vehicles participate in all these broader debates while also having their own specific characteristics that make them unique. Unlike Confederate monuments, which were often erected specifically to intimidate and celebrate white supremacy, Hitler's cars were functional objects that happened to be owned by a terrible person. Unlike many colonial artifacts which were stolen from colonized peoples, Hitler's vehicles were specifically built for him and have no prior owners. Seeking their return. These differences matter in determining appropriate responses, but the broader debates about controversial artifacts provide useful frameworks for thinking about Hitler's vehicles. The role of survivor testimony in shaping policies about Hitler's vehicles has been significant. Holocaust survivors and their descendants have often been consulted by museums and other institutions, attempting to develop appropriate approaches to these artifacts. Survivor views on the vehicles vary considerably. Some survivors believe the cars should be destroyed, viewing them as painful reminders of Nazi power that serve no positive purpose. Others support preservation in carefully contextualized museum settings, arguing that physical evidence of the Nazi era should be maintained to combat Holocaust denial and ensure future generations understand what occurred. Still, others are largely indifferent, feeling that the vehicles are minor symbols compared to the far more important work of preserving survivor testimony and educating about the Holocaust. institutions have struggled with how to weigh these diverse survivor opinions against other considerations. Generally, there has been movement toward consulting with survivor communities when making major decisions about Hitler vehicles, though ultimate authority typically remains with museum boards or owners. This consultation process represents an attempt to ensure that those most directly affected by Nazi crimes have meaningful input into how artifacts associated with those crimes are handled, even if final decisions cannot always align with all survivors' preferences. The technological obsolescence of Hitler's vehicles presents interesting questions about long-term preservation. As time passes, fewer people have the expertise to maintain and repair 1930s automotive technology. Specialized knowledge about these vehicles is gradually being lost as mechanics and restorers who worked with pre-war cars retire or pass away. Some institutions have responded by creating apprenticeship programs to train new specialists in pre-war automotive technology, viewing this as necessary to ensure the vehicles can be maintained into the future. Others have accepted that the cars will eventually become too difficult to keep operational and are focusing on preserving them in their current state, rather than attempting ongoing mechanical maintenance. A few have explored whether modern replacement components could be substituted for original parts that can no longer be obtained or repaired, though such substitutions raise questions about authenticity and whether extensively modified vehicles are still meaningfully the same objects. These preservation challenges affect all historic vehicles, but are particularly acute for Hitler's Mercedes, given their complexity, unique specifications, and the controversial nature that complicates preservation efforts. The educational materials that accompany displays of Hitler's vehicles have evolved considerably over time, reflecting changing pedagogical approaches to teaching about the Holocaust and World War II. Early displays often included minimal text, assuming that the vehicle's significance was self-evident. Modern exhibits typically include extensive multi-layered information addressing different audiences and learning styles. Text panels provide historical context and basic facts. Audio guides offer more detailed narratives. Interactive displays allow visitors to explore topics in depth. Video presentations include a survivor testimony and expert commentary. Educational materials explicitly address difficult questions about why the vehicles are preserved and how they should be understood. Some institutions have created separate educational spaces adjacent to vehicle displays where school groups can have facilitated discussions about what they have seen. Others have developed pre-visit and post-visit curricula that teachers can use to prepare students for encountering the vehicles and process their responses afterward. This pedagogical sophistication reflects recognition that simply displaying Hitler's cars without extensive educational support can be counterproductive or even harmful. The market dynamics for Hitler's vehicles have been affected by generational shifts in collecting patterns. Older collectors who experienced World War II or grew up in its immediate aftermath often had strong personal connections to that history that influenced their collecting interests. Younger collectors, for whom World War II is increasingly distant history, may relate to these vehicles differently, viewing them more as historical curiosities and less as emotionally charged artifacts. Some market observers predict that values for Hitler memorabilia, including vehicles, may decline as the generation with personal connections to World War II passes away. Others argue that historical significance will maintain values regardless of emotional connection, pointing to strong ongoing demand for artifacts from even more distant historical periods. The rise of historically minded younger collectors who approach World War II as an intellectual interest rather than lived experience may reshape the market in ways that are difficult to predict. Institutions monitoring these trends must consider how changing collector demographics might affect the long-term market for Hitler's vehicles and what this means for preservation and access. The question of whether Hitler's vehicles should be allowed to exist at all has been raised periodically throughout the post-war era. Some have argued that these objects should be destroyed to ensure they cannot become shrines to Nazi ideology or symbols of Hitler's power. This destruction argument has several forms. Some advocates argue for immediate destruction of all Hitler vehicles, viewing their continued existence as offensive and dangerous. Others propose a middle path where the vehicles would be preserved temporarily for study and education but destroyed after a certain period, or after all, Holocaust survivors have passed away. Still others suggest selective destruction, eliminating vehicles in private hands while preserving a few examples in major museums. Arguments against destruction emphasize the vehicle's value as historical evidence, their role in Holocaust education, and general principles opposing the destruction of historically significant artifacts. Opponents of destruction also note that eliminating the physical vehicles would not eliminate photographs or knowledge of their existence, so destruction might accomplish little while losing important educational tools. The debate reflects fundamental disagreement about whether objects associated with extreme evil can ever be redeemed through educational use, or whether their existence inherently serves the purposes of that evil, regardless of how they are contextualized. The insurance and liability issues surrounding Hitler's vehicles extend beyond simple property coverage to include concerns about potential attacks or vandalism motivated by the vehicle's associations. Museums displaying Hitler Mercedes must consider the possibility that outraged individuals or groups might attempt to damage or destroy the vehicles. Several incidents of vandalism targeting Nazi-related artifacts have occurred over the years, reinforcing these concerns. Security measures must balance protecting the vehicles against allowing reasonable public access for educational purposes. Some institutions have installed the vehicles in specially secured galleries with enhanced surveillance and physical barriers. Others have chosen to display replicas or photographs rather than actual vehicles to eliminate vandalism risk. Insurance policies typically include provisions addressing politically motivated damage, recognizing that these vehicles face unique risks not shared by other historical automobiles. The cost of adequate insurance and security can be substantial, adding to the total expense of preserving these controversial artifacts and sometimes leading institutions to question whether the educational benefits justify the costs and risks. The scholarly literature examining Hitler's vehicles has expanded to include not just historical research, but also theoretical work applying various academic frameworks to understand these objects. Material culture theorists have examined the vehicles as examples of how objects embody and transmit meaning beyond their functional purposes. Memory studies scholars have analyzed how the vehicles function as sites of contested memory, where different groups project different interpretations of history. Heritage studies researchers have investigated how decisions about the vehicles reflect broader patterns in how societies handle difficult heritage. Museum studies scholars have used the vehicles as case studies for developing best practices for exhibiting controversial objects. This theoretical work has enriched understanding of these vehicles beyond simple historical documentation, revealing how they participate in complex processes of meaning-making, memory construction, and cultural negotiation. The vehicles have become objects of academic interest in their own right, studied not just for what they reveal about Hitler and the Nazi era, but for what they reveal about how contemporary societies remember and interpret difficult pasts. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that you gain new insights into the fascinating and troubling story of Hitler's missing Mercedes. These vehicles remain powerful symbols that continue to generate debate and discussion more than 80 years after World War II ended. If you enjoyed learning about this topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Nazi Germany's U-boats after the war. Another incredible story of how the spoils of victory were distributed and what became of these once feared machines. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. We bring you these deeply researched historical stories to help ensure that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. See you in the next one.